Hi, I'm Tara, and welcome to Les Do Books. Email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with any questions or comments, or come join the Facebook group, The Lesbian Review Book Club. I'm really excited because I'm joined today by the fabulous lesbian romance and romantic suspense author, Lynn Ames, who I'm a huge fan of. Her latest book is Great Bones, and it's out everywhere. But Lynn's here today to talk about other people's books. Authors are readers too, so I'm asking her about what lesbian fiction books she loves. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Tara. It's really great to be here. I am so psyched to talk about this topic. You know, not many people ask me about other people's stuff. They always ask me about my own stuff. You know, that gets boring after. I was like, oh my God, I gotta talk about it again. But talking about other people's stuff, now that's a good time. You know, every writer, I think, becomes a writer because they love to read. This is an obvious progression. And the great irony is that when you become a writer, you have less and less time to read. It's wrong on every level. So the really good news is that I didn't start writing until long after I started reading. Yes, I did not write my first novel at 3. It's just a rumor. I did write a novel at 10. I still have it. I don't think it will ever see the light of day. Let me just say that.
Just give us a page.
I'll give you a page.
So there is a theme to the books that you want to talk about today. Do you want to share what that is?
So I really love to talk about the beginning, not the beginning of lesbian fiction because we don't have that kind of time, but I want to talk about my start in lesbian fiction, my introduction to lesbian fiction, which was long, long time ago, far, far away, since I'm old. All right, well, not old, but certainly middle-aged, let's put it that way. And, you know, when I discovered the books I'm going to tell you about, it opened up an entire universe for me. Think context. I was born in 1960. I went to college in the late 70s, early 80s. It was a time when we were all in the closet, and, well, almost all of us were in the closet, and we were frightened of being discovered, and we were just figuring out our sexuality, and I didn't really even know what a lesbian was at first. So I felt like a freak. I felt like an outcast, and I thought there was something really, really wrong with me. And when I discovered lesbian fiction, that changed everything. I was already in my first relationship, to be clear, but I thought that I was like the only one in the human race who might be a lesbian. I was in college at the time, and I was very confused, and all I knew was it was a really, really bad thing to be. And then, miraculously, I went to Provincetown, Massachusetts for the very first time, because I had heard that it was a place where you could be yourself, where you could openly walk down the street holding your lover's hand, and the idea of that was just amazing to me. I didn't think it was even possible. So my very first girlfriend and I took a trip to Provincetown, Massachusetts. The year was 1980. And I remember because we were riding bikes down the street, and we stayed in Nickerson's campground outside of town, lest someone think we were lesbians, really. And I held hands with a woman in the open for the very first time in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And then I ran into someone I knew from high school who was waiting tables, and I absolutely freaked out. But that's beside the point. Mm-hmm. Who is straight, by the way, as far as I know. In any event, when I went to Provincetown, Massachusetts in 1980, I happened into a little bookstore down a side alley. At the time, it was down a side alley, not where it is right now, called Women Crafts. And this was a new universe for me because it had books on the shelves that appeared to be about us, about people who acted like us, people who loved like us, people who were us. And I just got lost on the bookshelf for a bit. And I found things like Katherine v. Forrest. I found Curious Wine, and I found Patience and Sarah, Isabel Miller. And I found Debo Brinker and Bannon. These were the books that were there at the time. And I didn't dare at the time actually buy a book because I was afraid that it would be discovered, in my stuff back at college. So I sat there in the store and I read, but I didn't take the books home that time.
Mm-hmm.
That was 1980. Fast forward a few years and I'm out of college and I'm in my very first job, which was, I was a very public figure. I was a news anchor and radio talk show host. So it was not possible for me to be out at that time. I would have been fired for certain. And I didn't go to gay bars. I didn't do anything because I had a very recognizable voice. I was in radio. And, if I got on an elevator and said, 5th floor, please, someone would say, aren't you? And, there was just no way I could go anywhere. And I don't know why it never occurred to me at the time that if I walked into a lesbian bar and someone saw me there, it was probably because they were, I don't know, also a lesbian. Duh.
Right.
Didn't occur to me. Or I was just too frightened to take that kind of chance. And so it was several years into that career in the mid-'80s when I dared to I went back to Provincetown and I went back to Women Crafts and I picked up a book. I picked up several books, but the first book that I actually read cover to cover was Katherine V. Forrest's Amateur City, which was her detective series. And it was a revelation to me. Here were strong female characters who were having issues with relationships and love and mysteries and all kinds of things. And it was just a whole universe. And Katherine V. Forrest, in essence, gave me permission to be me. Told me I wasn't the only one. Told me it was okay. Thank God I didn't read The Well of Loneliness.
Oh, goodness.
Or Akiri if I had. But, something else interesting happened along the way, and that was, at around that time, in 1982, I saw my very first movie that had a lesbian character or a lesbian theme in it. And in 1982, you are much too young to know this, the movie was called Personal Best. Mariel Hemingway and Patrice Donnelly. And they were Olympic athletes. And I digress just a little bit, but it's funny because I didn't quite realize exactly what was going to be in it. And I took my grandmother.
Oh.
Not the cool grandmother, not my mom's grandmother, who, by the way, plays a very prominent role in my new book, Great Bones, but my dad's stodgy grandmother, the one who had the plastic on the furniture so that you didn't, soil the seat with your human oils.
Yep.
That grandmother.
Good.
I took her to Personal Best. And if you ever watch the movie Personal Best, there is a very explicit love scene between Mariel Hemingway and Patrice Donnelly. And at that point, my grandmother just looked at me and said, "We are leaving this theater right now." And I just wanted to climb under the seat, So we left the movie theater, and I had to sneak back and see it on my own later. And then, in the mid-'80s, I saw a second movie that had just come out called Desert Hearts. Mm-hmm. And I realized that it was based on a book. What? A book? And I went and I found Jane Rule's Desert of the Heart. Now, as I found these books, I discovered a publisher, and the publisher was Naiad Books. Oh, by the way, a little funny aside. So I go into Women Crafts to buy Amateur City and a few other things. And the woman behind the counter says to me, "Okay, it's going to cost this much, and you get 10% off as the lesbian discount." And I just panicked. I completely panicked. And I'm looking around the store to see who else heard her say that. And I'm like, "How did you know?" She's like, "Oh, honey." Okay, well, there you go. Am I that obvious? I wasn't aware that I was that obvious. Darn, I thought I was passing all this time. So that was just funny, and it just scared the living daylights out of me. I practically ran out of the store and thought I would never come back. And yet, every summer I would go back to Provincetown, and every summer I would buy more books and more books and more books. And at the time, it became clear to me in one of those first purchases from Women Crafts that Naiad put out a book catalog. And the book catalog got mailed to you every month in a little brown paper wrapper, so nobody would know what it was, from Naiad Press, and I would wait, and I would get that catalog, and the catalog had in it a check box list of every book that they had, and it featured, like back cover blurbs of every book that was coming out that month or that quarter. I think it was quarterly at first before it was monthly. And so I would voraciously read the back cover stuff, and I would laboriously sit there at my kitchen table and check off every book that interested me. And of course, they were all checked off by the time I was done, because there was so little lesbian fiction at the time. And I just couldn't get enough, and I just wanted to keep reading everything I could find. Amanda Kyle Williams in the early 90s put out a great series. She writes a lot of mainstream stuff now. She's a very big mainstream author. But Amanda Kyle Williams at the time was writing for Naiad Press, and she wrote a very cool, very edgy at the time mystery series. The first book, I think, is called The Singular Spy, and then The Providence Files, and 2 other books in the series. She only ever wrote the 4 for Naiad that I'm aware of, and I have all of the original editions, which if you were on video right now I could show you. You'd be jealous though, so maybe not. So anyway, so those were the first mysteries, the first lesbian mysteries I read were from her, and then Karin Kallmaker came out with In Every Port and Touchwood, and Katherine V. Forrest was writing more and more in the series that she was writing that Amateur City started. And it was just a whole eye-opening experience for me. So what I started to do was I was afraid to have Naiad send those books to me, because the postman would see them, God forbid. So I would save up those catalogs, and I would save up my money. And once a year in the summer, I would go to Provincetown, usually somewhere around 4th of July. My girlfriend at the time and I would go to Provincetown, we'd go to the beach at Herring Cove, and I would make my annual trip to Women Crafts. And I would literally start pulling the books off their shelves that I had on my list that I had saved for the entire year. And I would walk out with a stack of books. And literally, even back in that day, I was spending probably $400 on a stack of books.
Oh.
And I know, it was like half my salary. And I would try to ration myself so that I didn't read, them all in a night, which is really what I wanted to do. I just wanted to devour these things, So it was Katherine V. Forrest, and it was Amanda Kyle Williams in the early 90s and Penny Mickleberry in the mid-90s, who wrote another mystery series for Naiad. And she's still writing now, and so is, of course, Katherine V. Forrest is still writing too. And then, as I found some of their books, I found other books of theirs and other authors. So I literally, if you could see behind me where I'm sitting now, you would see that I have an entire floor-to-ceiling bookcase filled with lesbian classics, with all lesbian books. And so I just started collecting and reading everything, Claire McNabb and Linda K. Silva's early books about Delta Storm. And, I just picked up everything I could get my hands on, romances, mysteries. Didn't take long to read those books. They weren't very thick. Of course I read Curious Wine. So many people say that Curious Wine saved their life. Amateur City actually saved my life before I went back and read Curious Wine, which is a fabulous book. I mean, I can understand why this saved so many lives, And then I went back and I read all of Anne Bannon's work, and Lee Lynch's The Swashbucker, and all of these things added up for me and made me feel better about myself, better about what I was doing, more confident in who I was, and allowed me to escape into a different world, a different place. And that was transformative for me. That was transformative. It wasn't at that moment that I said I need to be an author, because I've been saying I needed to be an author since I was a little girl. Honestly, I would say when people asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would say I want to write books and be left alone. Why I thought I wanted to be left alone, I'm not quite sure, but I did. But I got half of it right. So for me, those early books were everything. They were everything. They were literally a lifeline. And I think that as we've moved forward through time, different generations have taken solace from new writers and different topics. But, if in those days back then you had ever told me that I would grow up to be one of them and that I would have, book signings in Women Crafts, the bookstore where it all started for me, I just, every time I walk in that bookstore to sign a book, I just get a huge kick out of it because it means so much to me. The bookstore moved across the street, some years after it opened. That bookstore opened in 1976. So my first trip there was, maybe 3 years after it opened. And then it expanded and moved onto Commercial Street in Provincetown. And if you, blatant commercial for Women Crafts in any independent bookstore, if you get a chance to walk into a women's bookstore, there are so few of them left these days, or an independent bookstore like that, go to an independent bookstore, not Barnes and Noble, go to an independent bookstore and just feel what it feels like to stand there among those authors and those shelves. And the books back then, what they did for me, I know that's what you want to ask next. Did you want to talk, Tara?
No, I was just wondering if there were any of the books that you would want to talk about in more depth, but we can also do that later if you want to finish what your thought.
At my age, you better let me finish a thought. And then I'll go back and talk about these books in a little more depth. So I thought at that point, the books were different than they are now, because in my humble opinion, where we are in the world, our context informs what we write. I could not write what they wrote back then and get away with it now. You all would say it is thin, it's not worth the money, it's simplistic, it's not, these characters aren't robust, the only stories are about coming out and, being in peril and this, that, and the other thing. But the truth of it was, these authors were writing the truth of their time. Just as we now, I think, are writing in many ways the truth of our time. We're informed by society. We're informed by our own environments and the things that we experience every day. And our experiences today, frankly, are different. And so the requirements of the readers are different. And so to talk about today's writers, you would be talking in a different context than the writers that I so revere from my early experiences. It's like you always remember your first. They say you always remember your first. Well, you always remember, I think, the first book in which you truly felt represented, the first series in which you felt represented, the first place you felt at home. How about if I read you something?
Please do.
When you open a Naiad book, when you did back in the day, when you opened the front cover, the very first page you came to had a little taste of what the book said inside. So that was always the first thing I looked at, and I made sure nobody was watching when I read it. And, so for instance, the very first thing I read when I opened Katherine v. Forrest, Amateur City, which is, again, it's a mystery series. It features a very strong female detective. Again, Ellen buried her face in her hands. "Please look at me, Miss O'Neill." Again, she raised her head. Kate Delafield, which is the character, the iconic character that Katherine v. Forrest created. Kate Delafield sat with arms crossed, elbows resting on the table. Her light blue eyes were not cold, they were not hostile, but they bored into Ellen's as if she were seeing all the way to the back of her head. There was a reason why a murderer got across that hallway to safety, why you never saw who it was. Your back was turned, and your back was turned because you were looking into Guy Adams's office. Through his open door into his office. Her voice rose slightly. "Isn't that true?" "Yes," she whispered. "It's true." Now, aren't you hooked?
Yeah.
Right there, you got to know all about Kate Delafield, and you got to know all about poor Ellen and how she's about to get nailed to the cross by Kate Delafield, right? So, Katherine v. Forrest and Amateur City, first in the exciting Kate Delafield series that has enchanted readers all over the world. This is the back cover of Katherine v. Forrest, Amateur City. She has been described as the undisputed giant of the gay mystery field. That is, that's who Katherine v. Forrest was at the time and still is. I mean, she's iconic. There's just anybody of my generation who came out when I did read something by Katherine v. Forrest, whether it was Curious Wine or whether it was the Kate Delafield series or whether it was...
Well, the sci-fi too, right?
Swords of the Guardian, right? Is that what it is? Sword of the Guardian?
No, that was Mary Shannon's book, but she did
Right.
Daughters of the Coral Dawn.
Daughters of the Coral Dawn, there it is. Right. Yes. I mean, she was writing in multiple genres, writing in ways that represented strong female characters in a way that women in the workforce at the time were not necessarily allowed to be that strong or that independent or that or that, or all that. And yet here she was writing these characters, making us believe that it was possible for us to be that. Everybody either fell in love with Kate Delafield or they felt like they were Kate Delafield.
So, do you think, because I'm probably going to sound like a jackass even asking this, but I haven't read enough of the books that were coming out at that point to know for sure.
Never known you to sound like a jackass.
I appreciate that. But because I haven't read many of the books that Naiad was putting out at that point, they really were the only game in town.
Pretty much. You had Firebrand books, you had a few others, and by the way, all the early Ellen Hart books, when she first started the Jane Wallace series with Vital Lies, so many years ago now. I mean, how many books are in the series now? There's probably 30, 35 or more, and she just got signed to a new 2-year contract. Yay!
Oh.
With St. Martin's Minotaur. Go ahead, ask the question.
Do you think that Curious Wine changed what lesbian romance looked like, and that we wouldn't even necessarily have the genre we have today because of that?
Yes. Now, look, because you asked a yes or no question in an interview, should never ask a yes or no question.
Well, I mean, there's also background to why I asked that, because I finally just read it last year. I started reading lesfic 6 years ago. So I came to it fairly late. Like, I came to it in my 30s and...
Late. 30s. I love you.
All right, listen. I'm just saying, there were some people, like, they were lucky enough to pick it up when they were in high school, and I was not one of those people. I happened to discover it when I was pregnant with my first daughter, and it was great, and it changed my life, but Curious Wine wasn't one of those life-changing books for me because it wasn't the first one I picked up. And so when I checked it out last year, because there were a couple of authors who had talked about it on this show, Nell Stark, I forget who the other one was, and I said, okay, I need to read this book. This is ridiculous. I need to do it. And it still felt so fresh and so good. And I mean, yes, the coming out part isn't necessarily as relevant now, but like the characters are so dynamic and the chemistry is so amazing and it's so erotic in a way that I didn't actually expect it to be. And it's so good. And I just thought, well, this is what everybody is still trying to go for in a way, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, to me, Curious Wine is a timeless classic. And what makes a book a timeless classic is that it will stand the test of time. It will stand up in different generations and in different circumstances. And this book, I don't care how well you know yourself, how comfortable you are in your sexuality, there is always a moment of recognition when someone reads Curious Wine, because we all had that moment where we first figured it out. Mm-hmm. You know, nowadays kids are figuring out when they're 10. Great, wonderful. But, you know, when we were having angst and not really figuring it out until we were in our teens and our 20s, and some of us a lot later, mm-hmm. You know, there's always the moment, everybody has universally that moment of recognition, that moment where they know who they are, or believe they know who they are for the very first time. Yeah. And that is, you know, something nobody ever forgets for themselves. And in terms of fiction, they never forget when they've discovered it, you know, and can empathize with it in a piece of fiction. Curious Wine was daring for its time. It was daring and different and bold and happy, and you know, the love that dare not speak its name was mm-hmm. spoken. Not just spoken, but spoken with beauty and passion and eroticism in a way that we weren't necessarily used to seeing or reading about. And it gave us permission to know that the things we were doing in our bedrooms and elsewhere were okay. They were not just acceptable, they were beautiful.
Yeah.
Curious Wine made it beautiful to be a lesbian, beautiful to be in a relationship with that type of love. And, there's not a lot of work that does that. So I think it doesn't matter what generation you read this book in. And yes, is it dated? It's dated by the time it came out, but not dated in the emotions that it evokes in you.
Yeah.
And for me, that is what makes a great book. This is a great book. It's, it's well written. It is sensuous and it really gets at every sense you have. You can taste it, you can hear it, you can smell it, you can feel it. And to me, that is a standard that is not easily met in fiction.
Well, and I think that scene, I talked about this with Georgia Beers when she was on the show, but that scene with the encounter games, when there's that first moment of recognition, but also the woman who was hosting them at the cabin and how antagonistic she was, and the tension in that scene, that holds up against any of the literary fiction that I've read ever. It's so good and so compelling. And so I was looking around the room, I wanted to talk to somebody about it as I was reading it because it was so good. And I ended up my poor husband had to listen to me go on and on about how amazing it was. And I almost made him read it.
Well, you should have made him read it.
Well, we are a house divided because I read only on my Kindle and he only reads actual physical books.
Wow. I love your husband, by the way. I'm with him. I read both ways. I'm that way. I read on my Kindle and I read, I treasure holding a physical book in my hands. I do. But depending on the timing and where I am and, what book it is, it's great because on my Kindle, I can read on my treadmill. I can take it places and it's so much easier. I just finished reading Lillian Faderman's nonfiction book, The Gay Revolution. It's an 800-page tome, a really important book. But I got to say, if I had to carry that sucker everywhere, it's interesting because my wife, Cheryl, had the physical book and it's actually autographed to both of us. So that's a very special book. But she had the physical book and I had it on my Kindle because we're reading it for a radio show that we're doing. And she kept saying to me, I have to get on the treadmill. Can I borrow your copy? Can I borrow your... And I would say, sure, I'll just, sit at the kitchen counter and put this thing on the island because I'm not holding this 800-page book on my lap.
No.
It's just not convenient. It's just not handy, And if you're going out someplace and you can just whip out your Kindle or your phone and just read for a few minutes. And
that's true.
I love the advent of ebooks. I do. I truly do. And I appreciate that. But I am a sucker for a hold in my hands, treasured book. And in fact, people ask me all the time, do you think that print books are going to go the way of the dinosaur? And my answer is, I don't think they ever will. I don't believe that. I think that there will always be a need and a desire to hold a book in your hands. I think that, technologies, of course, will continue to evolve and they may become less the thing you pick up and read, but they will still be the thing you collect.
Yeah, I don't actually understand why a lot of people seem to think it needs to be an either or.
I know. What is that about? I don't think it's an either or, especially not with today's technology where you can do print on demand and it doesn't cost you anything. You're not warehousing the books anymore. You're placing an order. The book's being created and sent to you. It's nothing. It's nothing.
No. So, were there any of the books that you did want to talk about more?
It's more about characters. There were certain characters back then that really stood out. And I'm not even just talking about the romance, but the series that involved strong female characters, strong detectives, strong women, period. To see that reflected in fiction in that time period was just empowering. It was uplifting. I mean, it still is to some extent now, but now we expect more or less to be able to reach those kinds of positions and to be in positions of power. But back then, that was an anomaly. It was not, the normal course of business, if you will. And so to see those characters and to watch them evolve through the series, I always liked back then watching them evolve through the series, like Kate Delafield did, like Carole Ashton, Carole Ashton, who is the character in Claire McNabb's books. I'll get it out sooner or later.
Claire Ashton is a fabulous author.
Yes.
But she is putting out books now.
Yes. Yeah, she may not be a great detective. She is a very excellent author, by the way. But Carole Ashton was a detective character created by Claire McNabb, who was an Australian author in the 90s. And she wrote this series, and I would wait, for every book to come out. I would just sit there and wait for the books to come out. And in fact, she just put out, with Katherine B. Forrest's help, because she is in poor physical health, put out the final episode, the last book in that series, which is simultaneously heartbreakingly sad, but also an amazing feat, because this character really deserved a good, a real closing chapter. And that is, and the reason why Katherine B. Forrest did that with Claire McNabb, is because Katherine B. Forrest had largely been the editor for the series. And so she was very well acquainted with the character, and so co-wrote this book with her to help her close it out. And I think that is, number one, a beautiful act of love and friendship. And two, I'm over the moon thrilled that now that I've finished writing for a day or two, I can actually sit down and read that book. I actually ordered the print version of that book because I have the entire series in print, starting from the very beginning. Yeah,
you have to then.
I think you do have to do that. I mean, there are some things you just need to have your fingers on, to turn the pages and to really feel the feel of a book. So there are those, so it was really, for me at the time, it was character driven. It wasn't necessarily single book driven. It was character driven. And it was the series that I would hold on to. Yes, I read, obviously I read a lot of romances at the time. Who didn't? I was just coming into my own and figuring it all out. And, I came out of the closet in 1987 to my parents and my family, but not at work. I couldn't come out at work. By that time, I had morphed into a very big public figure in government, and it wasn't safe to come out. But I was out everywhere else, every place but at work, essentially. So, yes, to have that bit of an anchor, if you will, in my universe, to remember who I was and what was important to me and where I came from. Those series and those characters lived with me, and much the way I hope and I think that every author now wants their characters to live on with their readers. Truly great characters stay with you, don't you think, for a long time?
Absolutely.
You carry them around with you, and every now and again you wonder what they're doing now, even though paper and they don't exist, but you wonder what they're doing now. What are they up to now, I wonder?
I do, and every so often, thankfully, sometimes an author will stick them in a later book that they write.
Will they now? Really?
Occasionally, I heard maybe, like, say, taking your favorite romance characters and putting them in to a later installment of a romantic suspense series.
Really? Did somebody do that?
I think I was about 10% of the way through, because you sent me Final Cut like right away when it was ready. And I think I was about 10% of the way through the book, and I had to put it down and reread All That Lies Within because I couldn't not go back and experience them again from the beginning.
I got you.
I know.
You know, I didn't do that cynically, but I know we're not supposed to talk about this, but I did not do that cynically just in order to get people to, go back and find those other characters. I didn't. It just worked. It just fit. Those characters fit together. It seemed like their universes belonged together at that point. And when something like that happens, it's just magic. It's magical. I love it when authors do stuff like that. And not for the wrong reasons, but for the right reasons. Do it because it's the right thing to do for the character. Don't do it because it's the right thing to do for your pocketbook. Do it because it's the right thing to do for the characters. I don't ever, by the way, do anything that I think is just the right thing to do for my pocketbook. I wouldn't write that way. If I did, I should stop writing.
Well, and for anybody that's listening that hasn't read Final Cut, you don't have to have read All That Lies Within or any of the Kate and Jay books first. That was just, I couldn't help myself because I love All That Lies Within, so I had to go back and see those characters again.
Had to do it.
Yeah.
Had to do it.
So, what would you say... Sorry, I'm torn between two things. I'm kind of curious to know about, what you were reading when you started writing again.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, let's start there. What were you reading? What were the books? What was getting you going when you started writing again?
You know what? I was so busy in my professional career at the time in the early 90s. I was spokesperson. Yeah, I see it's all driven by my career. In the early 90s, I was a spokesperson for the nation's third largest prison system. And I had no free time to read. I had nothing. If I could fit in a book, it was, like a David Baldacci or, somebody like that, or John Grisham, or something that I could just toss by the bedside and not care about. Lesbian books I cared too much about to do that too. So I would read something mainstream, something easy, something that I, if I didn't finish it, then I didn't finish it, and I would put it aside. But a curious thing happened on my way to the forum. And that was friends who were big Xena fans of the television show Xena. Mm-hmm. I had started writing a mainstream book based on an experience that I had had. And I had written the first few chapters, and I handed it to a couple of friends and said, what do you think of this? And I handed them, I think, the prologue and the first chapter, and they read the book, and they had said to me, and these were friends I'd met through the Xeniverse, they had said to me, yeah, it's really good. It'd be even better if it was lesbian fiction. And I said, well, it can't be lesbian fiction because, the guy gets killed off in the first chapter. And they said, yeah, well, it should be lesbian fiction. I'm like, but there's no secondary female character. And the female character that I had created was this character named Katherine Kyle. And by the way, when I first created Katherine Kyle, she was straight.
Really?
Not part of any lesbian universe. And it was before Xena came out. So I had created this 6-foot-tall, long-haired brunette with blue eyes.
Really?
Yes. And then Xena came out, and my friends read the description of Katherine Kyle and assumed that I had, pilfered it from the Xeniverse, which I had not. But having seen Xena, I thought, definitely her. She could play that part. Lucy Lawless could absolutely play that part. And so after 6 months of badgering the living daylights out of me, these friends finally convinced me that I should turn it into lesbian fiction. And I created the character Jameson Parker to go with Katherine Kyle. And, yes, that was a nod to the Xeniverse for sure. But it didn't start out that way for me. It ended up that way, but it sure didn't start out that way for me. So I started writing again because I went to visit these friends. This is a long story. I'll make it a little shorter. I went to visit these friends, and they took me to a bookstore called, in Denver, it was a little independent bookstore called the Garden something, Secret Garden something with the word garden in it. I wish I could remember what it was. But they took me through the aisles, and they started stacking books. They had me put out my hands, palms up, and they started stacking books on my hands. And they put all these books in my hands, Suzanne Beck and Melissa Good and all these other books, and T. Novin and Blaine Cooper. And they started sticking all these books in my hands. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you need to update your views of lesbian fiction. You need to read these books. And I probably walked out of there with 20 books that were uber. And I read them all, and I loved them all. And, they said to me, you can do this. What you've written is better. Write it. This is what you need to do. Read these books, and then you need to rethink writing your little straight thriller and do something different with it. And like I said, after 6 months of them badgering me about it, I thought, well, hey, why not? I can do that. So that's when I started writing again. That's what made me start writing again.
Those are some good friends.
Yeah. I had not been considering it. I was just going to write my straight thriller and send it off to a publisher, Simon Schuster or whoever, and that was going to be the end of that. I had just finished writing a memoir at the time, and writing somebody else's life, writing fiction, that sounded really, really good to me. That made me really happy. So I, at the time, had just ended a 16-year relationship. I had a little time on my hands. Mm-hmm. I had left public service, left my positions in government, and I had created my own public relations firm at the time. So I was working from home. I had my own schedule. I was flying all over the country giving speeches and stuff, and airports and airplanes are great places to write. So I just started writing what was in my heart at the time and what matched the times. And that is sort of the theme of, where I've been taking you on this little odd journey today that we've been taking, is to say our writing has evolved and changed over time. But that period of time, that fascination with the Xenoverse led to this whole explosion in the world of lesbian fiction, a whole new breed and blend of writers. It led to Georgia Beers, and it led to K.G. McGregor, and it led to all of these new writers who stepped into the breach and really updated lesbian fiction and what we were looking for. And so they started writing more complex stories and more stories that are not necessarily coming out stories, but they're more driven by the plot, not so much by the angst, but by the plot.
Yeah.
And, so times they are changing, and there are some fabulous authors. There are so many fabulous authors, I can't even name them all, who have taken the impetus from that period of time in the late 90s, early 2000s, and really taken it to a whole new level and a whole different place. And the writers that I loved so much back in the day are still writing. They're still at it. Katherine Forrest, God bless her, is still, writing out there. Certainly, Karin Kallmaker is a fabulous writer. She's still out there writing. Amanda Kyle Williams is ill at the moment, and I'm not sure what she's writing, but she, has really exploded onto the mainstream horror thriller scene. Mm-hmm. Penny Mickleberry is still writing. All these people are still writing.
Yeah, Lee Lynch too.
Lee Lynch is still writing. Jewel Gomez is still writing. Rita Mae Brown is still writing. All of these people are still out there working. God, bless them. Yeah. But our stories have changed because our times have changed, and that's a good thing. Evolution is a good thing, I think. We have so many diverse writers now who are writing in genres that we didn't even think of back when we were reading in the late 70s, early 80s. Anne Bannon, God bless her, is one of the nicest human beings in the world, and she's still very involved in lesbian fiction. It's wonderful. It's just wonderful. Mm-hmm. When I talk about the breadth of authors that are writing now, we have so much choice in what we read. There are serious literary writers. There's Sarah Waters, there's Emma Donoghue, there's Anne McMahon, there is Cheryl Head, writes some fabulous mystery characters. There's Carol Rosenfeld, who writes incredible humor in her work. If you haven't read it, you will laugh your butt off. There are quirky characters. Annie Marquette writes quirky characters, there's something for everybody. You want traditional romance, you can read Karin Kallmaker and Georgia Beers and Melissa Braden and K.G. McGregor, and the list goes on and on. Chris Bryant, and there's just hundreds of choices. There are people who are writing more, serious, deep topics. There's R.J. Samuel. There are independent writers, Carole Ashton. People you should find, people you need to find. Anne Roberts is writing great mysteries and some romances as well. I mean, there's just so many authors. Like I said, it's hard to mention them all, but there are some that I would urge you as readers to go beyond main publishers, because we have so many publishers now and so many independent authors now. There's so much to choose from. Don't just limit yourself to one or another. Go out and explore and find all of these neat authors who are all over the place. Our landscape is changing, as the technology changes, and books are coming from all different facets and all different quarters. But these are just some of the authors that I would tell you really should start to pay attention to.
And if you're wondering where to start, we have reviews for almost all of them at the Lesbian Review.
Yay!
Yay.
Let's go with the Lesbian Review. Want to?
Let's do it.
So we have the best of the old guard and the best of the new working at the same time, which gives us, as readers, so much choice in what we want to read. And to me, the beauty of now is the stories we're telling, and how wonderful is it that we don't have to tell coming out stories anymore. How beautiful is it that it's accepted and anticipated that your lesbianism is simply a part and a facet of who you are, or your transgenderism, or your bisexualism, or whatever ism it is. It's just one aspect of your person. And to me, that's what a gift that is. How wonderful is that? I don't know where we're going next with all of it, but we shall see. I promise that I'll come along for the ride. How's that?
That's pretty great. I think that's all, unless there's anything else that you have to say about your journey as a reader.
I would say to authors who are writing now, my colleagues who are writing now, keep writing what you're writing. I love reading what you're writing. I love the places you're taking us, the worlds you're building, the characters we're diving into. Keep writing, keep writing, keep writing, and I will keep reading.
Lynn, where can people find you online if they want to connect with you?
They can go to my website, linnames.com, and they can to buy my books and to learn more about me and to see some videos that I've posted there. I'm actually just updating my website, so they'll see it brand new by the time they listen to this podcast. They can find me on Twitter. They can absolutely find me on Facebook. I'm everywhere. I'm ubiquitous. I'm everywhere. So find me connect with me on Facebook if you can. I've only got a few friend slots left, but there are some, and you can certainly follow if you can't friend. Follow me on Twitter. Absolutely. Look at my website. Email me at linnames@linnames.com. I'm happy to answer you. And I wish you all well on your reading journey.
That's all for this episode. Thank you so much, Lynn, for joining me.
My pleasure, Tara. Thank you for allowing me to come and take up your time.
So, I'm Tara. You've been listening to Let's Do Books. Remember to email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with your questions or comments. If you're an author who's interested in joining me on this show to talk about the lesfic you love or trends that have you interested, please let me know. If you've enjoyed this episode, please check out the show notes where you'll find a Patreon link for the Lesbian Talk Show. Just a little bit would go a long way to cover hosting costs for the Let's Do Books and the other fabulous shows on the channel that are all geared towards queer women. You can find this and many other great shows by searching for the Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher, and you can find all of the podcasters from the channel on Facebook in the group, the Lesbian Talk Show chat group. You can also join our Facebook group, the Lesbian Review Book Club, to talk about these books and anything else you're reading and loving.